sent to any of them, but to a widow in Zarephath, in the region of Flists, only Naaman the Syrian. This is what we will be basing our discussion on, and several other scriptures at the top of my Twitter, or indeed my name on Facebook.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Indeed. Very interesting discussion. As usual, we always have interesting discussions. The blessing of a dedicated life. First, why did Elijah come to Elisha? Was this the plan of God? And if it was, what are we learning? What are we learning from this? Does it mean that sometimes God can have a plan for you and you're not aware about it?
For sure, God has a plan for our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, I think a lot of people are not aware of that. That's a reality. But I do think Elisha was aware that God had something in mind with his life.
Yeah.
I will explain maybe later on why. You know, Elijah was given a clear order. You know, I mean, he had done a lot of things, and of course he was becoming tired, and eventually he told God, I think I've had enough, you know, I would rather rest. And God said, okay, there's still some few things to do for you. And God gave him appoint Elisha to be your successor, okay, and then the time will come when you will be relieved. So one day, of course, there comes this time when Elijah is walking by Elisha, yokes of oxen. I mean, that's a sign of wealth.
Yeah.
Okay, and he was the one who was overseeing all of that. All of the other yokes were ahead of him, and he was the one with the 12th. So he was in charge, okay? And there comes Elijah. And of course, Elijah probably was a very well-known man in this area, so even Elisha should have known him. And when he came to him, something strange happened. Okay, Elijah didn't say anything, you know, he didn't even greet him. He just took his mantle and threw him on the shoulders of Elisha. And well, for us today in a modern world, we may not really fully understand what this was all about. Okay.
I mean, if this happened now, I'll probably report somebody for harassment. Why do you want to hit me?
Exactly. It could well be. You know, it could well be that this is something completely misunderstood. But I think Elisha understood it. You know, in the Old Testament, and many times we see that the mantle was very often standing for a particular person's ministry. So when Elijah took his mantle and took off the mantle and threw it on Elijah, I think Elijah somehow must have realized, God is calling me. Okay, I have got a work to do. I have to follow this man, and that's why I believe that Elijah had some kind of a relationship with God. Somehow he knew that one day there would be an experience which would call him out from what he was doing at that particular time. So, as I said, Elijah was not saying anything. He was just taking his mantle and just lifted with him and walked on. And when Elijah ran behind Elijah, okay, he says, what is it? You know, what have I done to you? Continue, go back. So it was like Elijah was a little unwilling, you know, to even take this man on his side, because, you know, if you read his recent history, he was not in good books with anybody, not even with God, you know. He had his issues. And so he felt, you know, what is this young man doing? But of course, he did put the mantle on him because God told him to do so. So before Elijah saw Elijah coming to him, you know, God had already seen Elijah. God had already singled him out to follow Elijah, okay, and become his servant. And that's very interesting, you know. So Elijah is not looking to be a master. He's not looking to be a successor. He is actually following Elijah, and he becomes his servant. Okay, it's a very interesting way when we see how Elijah was going back after he spoke to Elijah, he slaughtered his yoke of oxen, okay, and then he took the equipment, the yoke and everything that was pulling the plow itself probably, and he made a fire and he cooked the meat of the oxen. And then he gave it to all these people. 12 yoke of oxen, there were quite a number of people in the field there. And so he gave to them, and it was more like a farewell party.
So he knew he may not be coming back for that kind of work.
Actually, he knew that he would not come back. He cut the bridge. He broke the bridge into pieces, because he probably knew very well that God had communicated that before to him, that you need to go and do my work. Okay, and so he was not just saying, okay, let me try. If it works, I can follow. If it doesn't work, I can always come back to my yoke of oxen. No, he killed the oxen. He burned the yoke and the plow. So there was no coming back.
Yeah.
So in other words, it was a decision that was firmly taken. I'm going to follow him, whether it's easy or whether it's difficult. I will follow him. I will do my part. And this is where we can see an amazing dedication. Elijah was by no means an easy person to serve. That is what we see out of the whole story of Elijah. He was a very difficult individual. Of course, probably he had to be, because, he had so much opposition, and he had to fight at one time with 600 Baal's priests or 400 Baal's priests. So it was tough. And so even a young man like Elijah would not find it very easy, very comfortable to follow an individual like that. But Elisha had made up his mind, I will follow him, I will serve him. And so the Bible tells us that he left everything behind and he became his servant. That's very important that we understand that. He became his servant. He didn't come to become his successor, at least not at that time. First, before you become a successor, you become a servant. And Elisha was fully dedicated to serve, the very person who became now his master, the one who he would call father, okay? And he walked with him, he followed him. And it became well known in Israel that these two people were walking together and that Elijah was serving him. Interestingly, later on we see a scripture in chapter 3, where three kings come together, the king of Israel, the king of Edom, and the king of Israel, and they want to fight the king of Moab, who has rebelled against the king of Israel. And the Bible says they took a 7-day roundabout march, and they couldn't find the enemy. The enemy was always somewhere else, okay? And then Jehoshaphat, who was a God-fearing person, contrary to the other two, he said, something is not right here. Is there no prophet in Israel that we can inquire of him? What is going on here? And somebody in the army of the Israelites said, oh yeah, there is somebody here. And his name is Elisha, the one who used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. So in other words, that is another way of saying there is somebody who has served Elijah, the prophet, okay? And if he served the prophet, then he should be able to give us direction. Mm-hmm. And so they went to look for him, they found him, and for sure, he gave them direction, and everything that Elijah told them came to pass. And the enemy was defeated, and, the direction was amazing and powerful. So I think this is very clear, that Elijah was willing to be a servant, willing to serve, and he did that. And everybody even came to know about it.
Absolutely. In fact, my follow-up question on that willingness to serve was supposed to come from 1 Kings 19:20, the second part of 20, where it says, okay, from 20, and he left the oxen and ran after Elijah and said, please, let me kiss my father and my mother, then I will follow. So he went more or less like to get permission. Can I first go and say bye?
Yeah.
Then I'll follow you. And in response, I don't know what this response means, whether it means I'm not forcing you.
Yeah, exactly.
Says, go back again. For what have I done for you?
Exactly. So in other words, Elijah says, I didn't force you to come here. I didn't put any pressure on you. Do whatever you want. You know, if you want to come and serve me, that's your choice. But if you don't want to come, it's also your choice. And of course, Elisha went back. The Bible doesn't even say that he went to his mom and dad. For sure, he must have done that. But what the Bible is really reporting is that he slaughtered his animals, that he burned his equipment, and that he gave, a farewell party to all of his workers. That's amazing. And when he had done all of that, he knew where to find Elijah, and he followed him, and he became his servant, okay? Not his master, not his partner, not his successor, but his servant. So he was very much ready and willing to humble himself. Even so, he was a influential man, a wealthy man, a person who could have really made it big in life, and maybe had it already made big in life. But he was willing to humble himself and to really dedicate his life completely and totally to the prophet Elisha.
You know what this story reminds me? It reminds me of the time Jesus was looking for his disciples. He comes to these fishermen, follow me. He comes to these tax collectors, follow me. And they willingly follow. Some of them almost reacted in the same manner that Elisha reacted. Let me go and say bye to my, to my relatives. And we learned in the New Testament that the kind of jobs that these now disciples were doing, actually, in one way or the other, prepared them to do the job that Christ gave them. Is this what we are seeing in Elijah, that what he was doing is farming, is handling the oxen, is managing people, also probably prepared him for the work that his master had for him?
Absolutely. I think what is important to take note of is that, first of all, God does not choose any lazy people. He didn't just...
that's very important. Pastor.
I mean, all the people that God called, they were busy people. There's nobody sitting around who says, I don't know what to do with my life. Maybe God will give me a job. No, not like that. I mean, every one of them had a purpose for living, had a purpose for his work, and did exactly what was carved out for him. And I believe... you are very right that the work that we are doing before we come finally to the Lord is actually a preparation that God allows us to undergo so that we can be able to serve better. It's very interesting how Elijah was a well-organized person, well-trained, like you said, able to look after 12 yoke of oxen and the people who were taking care of all this work. And the same thing is true for the disciples later on. You see, you can see that Jesus never called anybody who was not hard at work, who was not doing anything. They were all busy doing something. And I think this is very important for us today to realize, because the principles of God, they don't change. I've sometimes seen people who said, maybe one day God will also call me. But meanwhile, they were not doing anything. They were just lazing around. And, I have told one or two of them, before God will call you, you better get busy. You better know what you are supposed to do in life and get yourself trained in one way or the other, because God is not calling people who are lazing around. He's always calling people who know how to work and who can be able to willingly follow the instructions that God gives them. Somebody who is working, take Elisha, for instance. Elijah, I'm sure he was trained by his father, okay? He was able to take instructions, and that's how he could be able to oversee all these other 12 yoke of oxen, okay? I believe that Peter and John and James and all the others disciples, they were people who were trained by either their fathers or other people like Matthew, the tax collector. You know, I'm sure he was undergoing training. You don't just sit on the tax collector's office without a training. So all of these people, they were able to learn to listen and to put into practice what they were instructed to do, and then were given responsibility to actually carry out the job that they were doing. And I think this is a very important requisition, a very important precondition for us to come into the ministry of God. You know, if we have no skill and we are too lazy to learn anything, then what good will we do in the kingdom of God? God is looking for people who, you know, have made their hands dirty, so to say, and who are willing to utilize their gifts and their talents. Remember what Jesus said to this man who was given a talent, one talent, while his friends were, one friend was given 5 and the other 2, and he was given 1 talent. And while the others were getting busy with what they were given, this man, he didn't even think of doing anything with that talent. He just dug a hole, hid it, and you know, he said, okay, when I need it again, I pick it up again to give it back to my master if he comes to ask me for account. And that's exactly what he did. And so when the master finally came, and he, you know, first of all asked the others, the one with 5, the one with 2, and they all brought back, an increase of what they had received. He always, the master said, well done, good and faithful servant. But when finally he came to this man who had received but not done anything with it, he said, you wicked servant, you know. And, you know, he scolded that landowner, that master scolded that man. And he says, you know, if you didn't want to work, at least you could have taken that resource that I gave you to the bankers and could have banked it. And when I now come back, I would have found some interest on it. But now you are a wicked and lazy servant. And then he ordered the bystanders, you know, he says, take away from what he has, because he's not worth the resource. He's not worth the investment. And so he lost even that one. And I think that's very important. You see, God will not take people who are just waiting and lazing around and not utilizing the resources that he has given to them. All of us, we have been receiving gifts and talents and abilities, and God wants us to utilize everything that he has given to us. And, you know, everything that God has given to us has the potential to multiply, okay? I mean, if you have a musical ear, for instance, you're born with a musical ear, does it mean you can play a piano? Does it mean you can play an instrument? Okay, maybe you have a good ear, you can hear the sounds, you might even be able to tell this is A, this is F, this is whatever, you know. But unless you sit down, you know, and utilize that gift that you have and begin to train, to practice, you know, you will not become a master. Even so, you have actually the gift of becoming one. But I think this is the problem that we see in our world many times. You know, there are people who are very gifted, but they are not going anywhere with their lives because they're not, disciplined enough, not dedicated enough, not, willing to invest themselves into that gift that they have and actually make something good out of it. You know, very often you hear Zambia has a lot of potential.
Yeah.
You know, and yes, for sure, we have a lot of potential. We have so many minerals in our ground. And for years and years and years and years, we have heard that we have potential. But I'm happy now that people are beginning to start digging.
Yes.
Digging for gold, digging for...
Potential must be brought to use.
Exactly, because potential you cannot eat. You know, you cannot even sell.
Yeah.
Potentially something that you say, okay, maybe in the future, but potential itself is a useless thing, okay, unless you begin to utilize it. And I think this is what we see in Elisha's life. He has utilized what God gave him in a very powerful way. We see the same thing also happening in the lives of the disciples.
Yeah.
You know, they were having gifts. They were not necessarily highly trained and well, versed with the happenings in the world. But what they had, they were putting it to good use, and God used it. Okay,
Absolutely.
and God will always use what we are putting to practice. Because eventually we should not just carry the gifts of God in our pockets, but we must be able to utilize them.
Indeed.
And only then can we be able to be useful in the hands of the kingdom of God.
Yeah. A few minutes ago, you did refer to someone looking for, let me just read, Second Kings 3, verse 11. But Jehoshaphat asked, "Is there no prophet of the Lord here, that we may inquire of the Lord through him?" An officer of the king of Israel answered, and this is why I'm interested in. There's potential being described, but in a way that one would think, can't they use a better description? So an officer of the king of Israel answered, "Elisha, son of Shaphat, is here. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah." So someone is looking for a prophet of the Lord here, that they may inquire of the Lord through him. And the only description or clarification they mentioned was that he used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. Why could they say he was Elijah's student, or or Elijah's handsman, or something like that?
Yeah.
Is this by virtue? Because if somebody says, "Hey, this is a secretary to the president," we know what secretary means. You're not a senior person, but by virtue of being secretary to the president, you are in an office that nobody else is in.
Absolutely.
Was this a perfect description?
I believe it was a very good description, because first of all, it tells us, and this officer was telling Jehoshaphat, who was looking for, guidance from somebody. This man was serving Elijah, who was the prophet. Okay, and everybody knew the prophet. Even Jehoshaphat must have known Elijah very well. So there was a man who served the prophet. If he served the prophet, then he must have, a return of the blessings on him. Also, he served him by refreshing him, pouring water on the hands of Elisha. I mean, when you have made your hands dirty, when you have been sweating the whole day, and you get a fresh water on your hands, and you're ready now to take your meal, that means you're prepared, isn't it? And you see, I think Jehoshaphat realized, if this man could have done this with the prophet, he can do it to me. He can do it with us here. Then also, I think it tells us another story, and that is that this man is used with water. He understands the purpose of water.
Yeah.
He's able to find the water. And, like in those days, it was not always easy to find water. Sometimes there were droughts, sometimes there was no rain, sometimes there were all kinds of difficulties. But Elijah was able to refresh his master. He was able to pour water on his hands. And Jehoshaphat immediately knew, this is the man that I have to get counsel from. Because if anybody has got an idea, this man will have an idea. Okay? And so he said, okay, let's go there. And they left their roundabout way, which was not leading them anywhere anyway. So they came to Elisha's home, or to his office, whatever. And Jehoshaphat was asking, what can we do? And Elisha was quite a bit tough. He says, if it was not for you, Jehoshaphat, who he knew was a God-fearing man, I would not even talk to you. Because, the son of Ahab, the king, Joram, he was a godless guy. And this king of Edom didn't have anything to do with God either. So I wouldn't even talk to you. But because of your sake, let me give you advice. And so Elisha gives an advice, He says, okay, what you must do, you must dig ditches. Interestingly, dig ditches. All throughout the road, dig ditches. And they did dig ditches, and he said it's going to be filled with water. Okay, and then when the enemy comes the next morning, okay, and the sun is rising, and we know how the sun is rising, it is shining with golden colors, with reddish colors, you know. And the reflection from the water would look to the enemy like blood. Okay? So, in other words, when the enemy came to look, and that was the advice he gave them, they did exactly what he told them to do. And then the next opportunity, the enemy came in and saw all of this, what looked like blood to him. They were rejoicing. They said, oh, these kings, they have slain each other. They have killed each other. And they were celebrating their victory, only to realize that it was not blood, but it was water. And actually it gave the people, the alliance of these three kings, the opportunity to defeat the enemy, the king of Moab. So, you know, you can see this man was a blessing, you know, to the people who sought counsel from him. Unfortunately, but the king of Judah says, I need to hear from the man of God. And he got his counsel, and he got that description. Here is the man who used to pour water on the hands of the prophet, you know, Elijah. So he knew this is the man who has the answer. And he had the answer.
Absolutely. I'm going to start now a very interesting description of our lesson. Mm-hmm. And of course, it's coming from 2 Kings 2, from 1 right to, let's just say, where the chapter ends. And I'll summarize this. So here is Elisha, who decides to follow Elijah. Now, fast forward. Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Bethel. That's when they were just on their way from Gilgal. You also said the same. Stay here. The Lord has sent me to Jericho. Mm-hmm. Okay? Now, at every occasion Elijah said this, Elisha always responded, as surely as the Lord lives and as you live, I will not leave you. Oh, that's like Naomi Ruth relationship.
Exactly.
Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And on all these locations, there was a company of prophets reminding Elisha, mm-hmm. Do you know that the Lord is going to take your master from you today? Mm-hmm. And he says, yes, I know, Elisha replied. So be quiet. Mm-hmm. So two things. Elijah is asking him to stay behind, and the company of prophets is reminding him of his master's death, just to discourage him. What do we learn from here?
Well, you know, it's very interesting, you know, as they were marching from a city called Gilgal, and then the prophet Elijah tells his servant, his assistant, why don't you stay here? You know, I've got a journey to do. You don't have to follow me. Mm-hmm. And he says, I can't leave you alone. I'm going to be with you. He arrives at Bethel, and as Bethel, you know, there were quite a number of student prophets, most probably students of Elijah. Mm-hmm. And they came out and they said exactly what you said, you know, do you know that your master is going to be taken from you? And he said, yeah, it's okay, you know, but don't talk about it. Then Elijah carries on. He says, I have to go to Jericho, okay. And again, the student prophets came and says, hey, do you know that today is a day? Interestingly, all of these student prophets, they knew what was happening just as much as Elisha himself mm-hmm. knew. But they were just saying, this is what is happening. But they didn't follow Elijah. They didn't stay with him, you know. But Elijah, you know, he was, for better or worse, he was with Elijah, his master. And he said, I'm not going to leave you. You know, no matter what, I'm going to be with you. And so, okay. Then again, he says, I must go to Jordan. Why don't you stay? You know, you don't have to follow me. Now, Elijah knew that his time to leave had come. Mm-hmm. And Elijah also knew that his time had come. Even the prophets, student prophets, they knew that. But those they stood watching from a distance. But there was only one man who was on the side of Elijah all the way through. And this is amazing. To me, this is a very powerful lesson. Okay, so then Elijah comes to the river Jordan. He takes the very same mantle he had thrown on Elijah, and he folded it and he hit the waters of the river, of Jordan River. And lo and behold, the Jordan opened to the left and to the right, and he was walking through dry land. You know, of course, that reminds us of the people of Israel when they came out of Egypt, that God opened the Red Sea for them. It also reminds us that when the people of Israel finally came to the promised land, on the other side of the Jordan, God did exactly the same. You know, the prophets had to step into the water, and then the waters were divided, and they could walk through dry ground. And so, Elijah is a student. You know, he learns. He sees what Elijah is doing, his master. Okay, so they walk to the other side, and of course, Elijah is a beneficiary of what Elijah is doing. Okay, so Elijah, the old man prophet, comes to the other side, and Elijah, the young servant, is just on his heels, and he is getting the benefits of the open Jordan. Okay, walking through dry land on the other side. And so finally, when they had come to the other side, there's something that didn't happen any time before. Okay. And to me, this is a very important lesson. That's why I think it's very important sometimes to stick around as long as you can, The prophets, they knew that Elijah is to be called by God, but they stayed there. But Elijah, the student prophet, the one who was following him in, the one who poured water on his hands and refreshed him, he said, I'm not going to leave you. And when they were finally the two of you, all the others were remaining behind, all the noise was gone, and they were just the two of them. Elijah turns around, and this time, not the angry man that he sometimes may have been, but this time very compassionately say, Elijah. And I could imagine that he said, you have really served me. You have been with me all the way. Up to this moment in time, you have never left me. You have never forsaken me. Now, what can I do for you before I'm going? And, what would you have said? What would I have said? Sometimes I ask myself, if I would have been with such a great man of God, Elijah, what would I have asked him? And, when Elisha heard that question, of course it gave him an opportunity to say anything he wanted. But what he said was amazing, okay? He said, Elijah, I actually want the same spirit that is on you to be on me. And not only the same, but a double portion of that spirit. And Elijah said, wow, this is a very hard thing that you have asked. And Elijah doesn't say, okay, fine, no problem, this is easy. No, even Elijah says, and this was the great prophet at the end of his career, if you may say so, he said, this is something hard. Nobody has ever asked me something like that. But then he said something very important. He said, when you see me go, okay, then you will have what you asked for. If you don't see me go, you will not have it.
Okay, Pastor, just there. There are some thoughts I don't want to forget. We are getting to some very interesting points here. First, at the point where Elisha used to respond, so be quiet. Sometimes we give attention to discouragement. We give attention to negative vibes, where we even know that if the more I pay attention to these things, the more I get discouraged. But here is Elisha telling us exactly what to do or how to behave when you start entertaining negative vibes to your ears. Those things are going to change the way you think and perhaps even the way you act. Here is Elisha who said, I'm not going to entertain their discouragement. Yes, I know, but just keep quiet.
Yeah, I think that is a very important point. Yesterday actually I had a session with some of our young people, and I spoke about the art of listening. Okay, we need to pay attention to what is important, and we also need to switch off what can derail us. And I think when these prophets' companies, these student prophets were telling him, it was more like saying, why are you going with him? Because he's going anyway. Just let him go. Come and join us. We watch from a distance, because none of these other people who were trained by Elijah was even thinking of walking with him. They said, he's going, so let him go. Okay, but Elisha said, don't talk. I have set my mind on my pilgrimage, and I'm not going to let go of it. I'm reminded about certain times when God tells his people to be quiet. Okay, for instance, one of these days, one of these experiences was when the people of Israel came out of Egypt, and they were in front of the Red Sea, which was impossible to cross, and then behind there were the Egyptians. And then they were making noise. Moses, why did you bring us here? Were there no graves in Egypt? And then God said, tell them to shut up. Okay, I say it with my words, but that's what God said. Tell them to be quiet. Okay? And I think it was a very strong kind of demand and command. Why? Because what they were saying was negative, was talking about dying when they were supposed to live. We're talking about defeat when they're supposed to be overcome. Okay? And so God said, hey, shut up. You better start going. You start moving. The same thing happened again when the people of Israel were in the promised land. They had crossed the Jordan River and had seen again the wonderful hand of God. And then he says, okay, there's this city of Jericho. And this city of Jericho was like at the crossroads, so I had to defeat that city of Jericho in order to continue entering into the promised land. Why God brought them to that particular place, I believe God had a purpose for it, because he wanted them to see the power of God in their lives and wanted to encourage them through it. So God said to them, you need to go around Jericho every day, once a day, and then on the seventh day, you just continue going around 7 times. And then he told them a very important instruction. He says, be quiet, don't say anything. Can you imagine what they would have talked about if they were allowed to talk? They would have been in the 3rd day or the 4th day and said, we have been walking and walking and walking and nothing is happening. Nothing is going to happen here. That would have been a voice of unbelief. And that's why God said, you keep quiet. You don't say anything. That's the easiest way to control unbelief. Okay. And when finally, he said, when finally you have finished your assignment, then make a joyful noise. And that's when the walls of Jericho will come down. And for sure they came down. So they didn't come down. God told them to make these rounds around this city, and they were not allowed to voice their unbelief. That they would have definitely done that if he would have allowed them to speak. But then he says at the end, you make a joyful noise, and that's when the victory was won. And I think we must just realize God wants us to have victory. He doesn't want us to have defeat. And too often we talk too much, too much of unbelief. Sometimes we need to heed the words of the Lord, to be quiet and just let God work out his miracles on our behalf. And he does that. Okay, and we see that in the life of the Israelites several times. And again, he is doing the same thing over and over again. So we are very encouraged when we look at that particular thing.
Absolutely. So now let's get to the end. Elijah asked, what can I do for you before I'm taken from you? This question came right at the end. It did not come at Gilgal, not at Bethel, nor at Jericho. And of course, we are seeing a good lesson here. Sometimes we are allowed to pass through situations. So first, to test us, God could be testing us, testing our loyalty, our dedication, our commitment, our availability, our dedication. But also preparing us, it's like pushing us through a furnace, like gold is, to refine us to the point where we can say, okay, or the person doing that can say, this person is ready. So he asked, in response, Elisha said, and that's where you were before I cut you, Elisha said, a double portion of your spirit. And Elijah said, you've asked a difficult question. Yet, if you see me when I'm taken from you, it will be yours. Now, how many times did Elijah give Elisha an opportunity to stay behind? And Elisha said, no, I'll continue. So if Elijah, and confirm with me, if Elijah stayed at Gilgal, at Bethel, or at Jericho, he was not going to get this.
You are absolutely right. In fact, he gave him an opportunity to go back,
Yes.
even when he was calling him from the field.
Absolutely.
But Elijah said, I have heard the call of God, and I will go my way. I will be with you no matter what. And, many times, people want to make it easy for you to stay behind. I remember when I first came to Zambia, one of my colleagues said, if it's too difficult, there's nothing wrong, just go back home.
Yeah.
And thank God I didn't do it, because you are very right, all these other people who were servants, or let me say students of Elijah never asked him such a question, because you had to be with him to the very end. And if nobody was going to be at the end with Elijah, then he would never have asked this question to anyone, okay? But because there was one, he could ask, what do you want me to do for you? And you can see that Elijah was really appreciating the work of Elisha in his life. This man had served him, and had served him well, and he was appreciative. And he says, I really, there's not much I can do for you here out in the wilderness, but, ask me, what can I do for you? And Elisha knew what he wanted. He wanted to really walk in the footsteps of his master, even after he had gone. Okay, it's one thing to walk with him to the very moment when God will take him away. But it's another thing to continue walking in his footsteps even after he has gone. And that's what he wanted. He didn't want to go back to his animals, they were dead anyway. He didn't want to go back to his field. He wanted to continue walking in the ways of the Lord. And he says, that's why I need to have your spirit upon me. And not only the same spirit, but even a double portion of your spirit. And the double portion in the Old Testament was very meaningful, because that was usually given to the firstborn son, So you get the portion for you as a son, and then you get your father's portion as well. That means you have a double portion. Okay? So God would give all the children a portion, and then when finally the father is gone, the portion of the father would be added to the firstborn, and that would be a double portion. And that's exactly what he was asking for. He says, you have already given me a portion, but I want to have your portion. I want to have that double portion upon my life. And for sure, like I said, this man, knowing God and having been a great prophet, Elijah, he said, I can't do that. He didn't say it that way, but he said, what you have asked is difficult, okay? But, Elijah knew that only God can do that. He could not do that. And, we also need to understand our limits. Even when we have worked for the Lord for a long time, we must know what we can and what we cannot do. So Elijah knew that what this young man has been asking, I cannot possibly do. But God can do it, and I leave it in the hands of God, whether he's going to do it or not. Yeah. But, the very dedication that we see in the life of Elisha, the very, consistency and dependability in his life, that made God answer that prayer. Okay, and to me, this is meaningful. I think it's very important for us today as well. When we have been consistent, when we have been dedicated, when we have been committed, when we have been dependable, then God will really do something mighty in our life. And that's exactly what God did. So for sure, when that moment came, that the chariots of Israel, the angels of God came and took Elijah away, Elisha was shouting, my father, the chariots of Israel, and of course he saw him go. Okay, so in other words, when he saw him go, because normally you don't see something like that happening, but he saw him go, okay, that was indication that God was answering his prayer. And not only did he saw him go, but he also saw how his mantle fell on the ground. So Elijah was gone, but his mantle was there. Okay, and so he picked up that mantle, and eventually, I don't know how long he was gazing into the sky, or how much he was. I mean, it must have been a solemn moment. It must have been an amazing experience. We don't know. He could have been there for an hour, for 2 hours, for 5 hours. We don't know. But eventually, he picked up that mantle of Elisha, walked back to Jordan, where they came from, where Elijah was taking that mantle and was striking the waters of Jordan, and the waters divided. And so now there was no more Elijah. So Elisha took that mantle, and he was asking that question, where now is the God of Israel? And he hit that water. And what happened to Elijah when he took his mantle and hit the water now happened to Elisha too. So in other words, the answer to his prayer had really come to Elisha. The Spirit of God, or the Spirit of Elijah rather, was on Elisha as well. The great old prophet who had now been taken back by God himself was now transferring that Spirit on the servant, that student, Elijah. And, interestingly, the people who were watching, the people who were not going along, the people of Jericho, they were watching what was happening. They were seeing him come. They were seeing him come alone. Elijah was no longer there. Of course, they were not surprised because everybody knew that Elijah would be going. But when they saw he's upon Elisha, okay, so in other words, they realized, yes, that transfer has taken place. They didn't know about that prayer, that question, what do you want me to do for you? And none of them heard that question. If they were with him, they could probably have heard the same question, but they were not there. And so at that moment in time, it was proven beyond any doubt that the prayer, the request of Elijah was being fulfilled, not by Elijah, because he was just a human being, but by God himself. He anointed him with the same Spirit that was on Elijah. And interestingly, when you are counting in the scriptures, the amount of miracles that Elijah did, the great prophet, and Elisha, his servant or his student, you can find that he did double as many miracles as his father.
So take us through some of the miracles in Elisha's ministry, which point to the fact that he indeed experienced blessings as a result of a dedicated life.
Well, I think there's no question about the dedication we see in the life of Elisha. He was somebody who was not playing. He was serious. He was committed. Okay? And when he came back, when they saw that the spirit of Elijah was on Elijah, they said, oh, we have a problem in our city, The water is bad, and as a result of the bad water, we have miscarriages, and we have got all kinds of diseases, and, we are not doing well. Okay, so they were asking him to do something, and Elisha said, okay, bring me a bowl, a new bowl, okay, and put salt into the bowl. And then Elisha went to the right place, and he poured that salt into the water, and the water became healed. A whole city was blessed through a dedicated minister of the Lord, okay, to somebody who had been committed, dedicated, dependable to his master at any moment in time. So he became a huge blessing. Going a little further, we find that one of the widows came to him. In fact, their husband was one of the student prophets under Elijah's ministry. And she comes to him and says, I'm in trouble because my husband has died, and the only thing I have left is my 2 sons. But we are in debt, and I don't know how to pay the debt back. So what can we do, you know? And Elisha is asking this lady, what do you have? What do you have in your house? And she says, I have nothing. And then she remembers, oh, I just have a little oil left. Okay, and she said, and Elisha said, oh, very good. So he said, he gave her instructions, go around, tell your sons and yourself, go around and ask for vessels, empty vessels, as many as you possibly can, and bring them into your house. And when you have entered into your house, then begin pouring the oil into these vessels. Interestingly, you know, it was not Elijah doing, he just gave instructions. You know, most of the time Elijah is even absent, you know, even when Naaman, the Syrian ruler, was coming with leprosy, he just gives instructions, do this, then you will be healed. He's not one of these healers who always wants to be in front. Okay, so he tells this lady, go into the house and keep pouring that oil, okay? And so she began to pour oil. From the little bit of oil that she had left in one of the bottles, she began to pour. In one bottle, it was full, put it aside. In another bottle, it was full, put it aside. In another bottle, it was full, put it aside. And she did that. And then she told one of her sons, bring me another bottle or another vessel. And he said, oh, we have run out of vessels. The vessels are finished. And then she looked around and he found, amazingly, all the vessels were full of oil. And then the oil stopped flowing. Okay, so in other words, oil needs an empty vessel.
Yeah.
Okay, so she now goes to the prophet and says, hey, I've done what you told me, so what should I do next? And the prophet said, go and sell the oil until you have enough to pay back your debt, and then the rest you live on it. And that's exactly what she did. What a blessing, you know, that he brought for somebody who would have been in trouble. You know, these boys would have gone into slavery if Elijah did not come in. And so we see many of these wonderful miracles that happened. One time, you know, Elijah was asked by those who were with him, you know, those who studied, you know, the ways of the Lord with him. And they said, our place has become too small, so we need to make some more room. And Elisha said, okay, let's go ahead. And he said, but we want you to come along. And he says, no problem, I'm coming along. And then they were busy at work, you know, cutting trees in the forest. And at one time, you know, they cut one tree near the river, and the axe head was loose, and it came off, and it fell into the water. And the young man who was cutting, he said, oh no, this axe was borrowed. So in other words, in trouble, because what do I tell the owner when I come back? I don't have the axe anymore. And Elisha said, okay, where did the axe head fall? He says, just somewhere here. He says, okay, fine. And so Elisha, I don't know how he did it or what he did, I don't know, but he made the axe head flow on the, you know, swim on top of the water. Now you know how heavy an axe head is. Yeah. And an axe head doesn't flow on the water.
It
you know,
it goes
straight down because it's heavy.
Yeah.
Okay, but you know, Elijah had that anointing of you know, taking, you know, going against the rules of our physical world. Yeah. Okay, and he made that axe head swim. And when it finally came to the surface, he said, go and pick it. And they picked it. And can you imagine the celebration they had on that day? You know, it must have been wonderful. And so you can go through the life of Elisha one by one. He became a blessing to many people. Okay, at one time there was a lady who made space for him, you know. Every time he would pass by, she said, you know, I want to honor you. You are a prophet of God. I want to honor you. So she made a special room for him. And she blessed him with that. And at one time, you know, Elisha said, we can't just receive all these blessings. And so he asked his servant, what can we do for this lady? Okay, because he wanted to show his gratitude. And then the servant goes and finds out and says, she has got one problem. She doesn't have children. She can't have children. And Elisha said, fair and well, very good. So he calls the lady and says, okay, you will have a child. And the lady is, I know, I've been trying to get a child for years and years and years and it didn't happen. And now you tell me this? Okay, for sure. A year later, the boy was there.
Boom.
Okay. And he grew up, and every now and then Elisha came by, he was doing his work, and every time he saw this boy growing. One day, he sees servants coming from that lady's house. And of course, this lady was a well-to-do lady. She had influence, she had money. That's why she was able to build him a house or a special room. So one day, they saw these people come, and they said, what is it? And they said, oh, that boy has died. Okay? The same boy who was, born by a prophecy of Prophet Elijah died. And so Elisha said, okay, I'm coming. Okay, so they had put him in the same room where he was always, lodging. And they put him on that bed. And they tried everything possible before he died, but eventually the boy died. Okay, and so Elisha said, don't worry. Elijah knew this is a gift of God, and the gift of God cannot be taken away like that. So he went in, and he says, okay, just leave me alone. So he stretched himself out on top of the boy, and he stayed with him, until he became warm. The body had already become cold, and then the body, the temperature of the body became warm again. And eventually, the boy started sneezing, okay? And the boy came back to life. And so he told his servant, go and call the mother. And then he says, okay, here is your young man. Here is your boy. And he gave him back to her. Now, these are all amazing, extraordinary miracles of God. But for Elijah, it was almost like, natural. He wanted to be a blessing, and he could be a blessing because he was such a wonderful, dedicated individual who had never, left anything out to do the best he could. So he brought life back. And, we see this time and time again in an amazing way. So this man became a great blessing because of his commitment, because of his dedication, because he was dependable. When God told him something, he understood it and he carried it through.
Pastor, thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
That can be you as well, Stay dedicated to the calling of God. Never give up, no matter what happens on the way, no matter what people say, no matter the negative vibes that you're getting from people. Just don't give up. Stay on the track, run to win. You will be a blessing just because of your dedication, just like Elisha was. You may not be a prophet, not at all. You may not be a pastor, not at all. But in your own world, in your world that God created you to have influence, you can be a blessing to the people around you. And that's the challenge from tonight's discussion on Run to Win. Will you be dedicated? And once you are, my brother, my sister, trust me, you'll be a blessing to everyone who gets in touch with you, to everyone that is influenced by your life, your deeds, and your walk in your life. Thank you so much for joining us on Run to Win tonight. Next time you see us, it's another interesting topic. I always never miss my word. That will be next week. In the meantime, please be good and be responsible, and please stay dedicated. Bye-bye.
Giant needs are cowering before you.